Mason Hale hadn't expected the air to taste like stone. He stood on the cracked porch of the old mansion, a brass key in one hand, the other resting instinctively near the collar of his dog. Diesel, a retired canine German shepherd, sniffed the bottom step with slow, deliberate purpose. The dog's ears were upright, body still but alert, like he was listening to something Mason couldn't hear. Behind them, the gravel road of Willow Ridge disappeared into a winter haze. No cars, no birds, just wind skimming across the cotton fields like a whisper that refused to rise. The house loomed in silence. 3 stories of pale grey stone, the structure looked both magnificent and broken. The porch roof sagged on one side. A shutter hung loose on the upper floor, tapping against the wall like a lazy heartbeat. Yet the walls still stood straight, solid, heavy. Mason had seen worse in Afghanistan. He inhaled once, pressed the key into the lock, and turned. It clicked too easily. Inside, the air was dry, not damp. A layer of dust covered the floor, but the scent was wrong. Aged paper and wood, but not mildew. Not untouched. It smelled recent. Diesel stepped past him and moved through the foyer like he'd done this 1,000 times. He sniffed the baseboards, circled the stone fireplace in the front room, then froze. His body locked, tail stiff, one paw lifted. Mason followed his stare. The wall across from the fireplace had been repainted. Poorly. The edges didn't match. A smear of plaster had bubbled in one corner. Mason stepped closer. The texture was different, less settled, less aged. Diesel let out a low growl. It wasn't loud, but it carried. Mason crouched down and ran his fingers along the edge of the wall. The plaster gave slightly under pressure. A fine line, a seam, caught in the afternoon light leaking through the shutters. Something had been covered. He didn't need more than that. He stood, walked back out to the truck, and returned with a flathead screwdriver from the emergency kit. Diesel stood watch, unmoving, eyes locked on the uneven patch. Mason chipped away at the plaster carefully, exposing rough stone beneath. He worked silently, breath-forming clouds in the cold air, his pulse rising with every flake that fell. Then came the sound, a hollow thud, different from the rest. He froze, pressed his palm flat against the surface. Beneath the wall was not more stone, but space. He looked at Diesel. The dog's ears were tilted forward, eyes sharp, nose twitching. "You hear it too," Mason murmured. The next swing cracked a corner loose. A small panel, once hidden under plaster, dropped open with a dull gasp. Behind it, darkness, and a set of narrow stairs descending into the unknown. He should have waited, should have tested the structure, checked for gas, rot, animals. He didn't. Diesel led. The dog stepped into the narrow passage with the poise of a soldier, his claws tapping wood that moaned with memory. Mason followed, flashlight in hand, the beam cutting through a fog of dust and time. The air turned colder, heavier. Below, the steps ended in a room carved deep into the foundation, part cellar, part bunker. And it was full. Metal file cabinets lined the walls. Cardboard boxes stacked with labels in fading ink. A desk in the center. A broken lamp. A photograph pinned under glass. Mason moved forward, brushing away a layer of dust from the picture. It was a man, young, tall, in uniform, standing beside a German shepherd that looked too much like Diesel to be coincidence. His father. And a dog he'd only heard about once, in a drunken memory whispered by his mother. Your father didn't just serve. He dug too deep. Diesel stepped beside the desk, nose to the ground. He paused at a filing cabinet, barked once, sharp and decisive. Not fear, not aggression, a warning. Mason spun the beam toward the far wall, footprints, faint, but fresh. The dust had been disturbed, by boots. Someone had been here, recently, and the house had not been empty. Diesel turned, tail rigid. His body shifted between Mason and the stairwell. A low rumble began deep in his chest. Mason didn't speak. Didn't need to. He reached for the drawer beside the desk and opened it fast. Inside, dozens of folded legal documents, land deeds, maps, surveyor notes, and at the bottom, a folder labeled Keene. The name hit like a punch. Nathan Keene, current mayor of Willowridge, the man who stood at the auction podium just days ago, the one who smiled too wide when Mason raised his hand at the 50-cent bid. This wasn't a forgotten property. It was buried history. Diesel let out another growl, louder this time. Then silence. No creaks, no groans from the floorboards above. Just the stillness of a house holding its breath. Mason flicked off the flashlight. Darkness swallowed them. Diesel stayed close, his body pressed to Mason's leg, steady as a stone wall. The weight of the files, the photograph, the hidden stairwell, none of it felt random. Mason whispered, more to the dog than to himself, "We're not alone here." And above them, the house did not answer. It listened. Diesel wouldn't stop digging. It wasn't panic. It wasn't boredom. It was something else. Something older than training. The shepherd pawed at the broken plaster, nose low, body rigid. Each movement was precise, deliberate, like he already knew what lay beneath. Mason stepped back, flashlight in one hand, the other resting lightly on the grip of his pocket knife. His heart pounded with a rhythm he hadn't felt since Kandahar. Not fear exactly, but the kind of pressure that fills the chest before something shifts. The panel clicked again, then gave way. Behind it, a narrow passage opened like a mouth, dark, dry, and swallowing cold air. Mason raised the beam and caught the start of a staircase. Diesel was already moving. The dog descended first, his body low, careful, but fearless. Mason followed, ducking under the low ceiling. The wood steps groaned under his boots, but held. At the bottom, the air thickened. Earth and paper, not rot. It was a hidden basement, deeper than any listed on the county survey. The room was square, maybe 15 feet wide. Filing cabinets lined one wall. Boxes were stacked neatly, labeled by hand. On a table in the center sat a small tin lamp with a cracked shade, still plugged in though the cord ran nowhere. Diesel circled once, then sat beside a stack of boxes marked 1974, Private. Mason moved to the table and opened the nearest folder. Land deeds, property transfers, handwritten notes on township maps, several names recurring, Reeves, Dalton, Yancey, and another, Keene. Mason's pulse stuttered. He kept flipping. The ink grew older, but the signatures were sharp. Some were duplicated, others clearly forged. Then came a photograph tucked between pages, a black and white print, slightly curled at the edges. His father. Younger. Maybe late 20s. Dressed in a county investigator's uniform. Standing beside a dog that looked like Diesel in every line of muscle and posture. And the strangest part, his father was smiling. Mason turned the photo over. One word, faint and almost erased. Testimony. He set it down and opened the next folder. Inside was a sealed envelope, yellowed, brittle at the corners. No stamp. Just a name written in a clean, angular hand. To Mason, if they let you see this. His fingers trembled slightly as he broke the seal. The letter inside was short, written in pencil. If you're reading this, I didn't make it out. I thought I could expose them, but the town runs deeper than I knew. Nathan Keene controls more than land. He controls fear. Don't trust what you see on paper. Trust what the dog finds. The shepherd never lies. Mason blinked hard. He looked down. Diesel hadn't moved. The dog's eyes stayed fixed on him, Not waiting for a command, just watching. Present. The flashlight flickered. Mason checked the battery, then turned back toward the stairwell, and froze. A new sound came from above. Not wood settling, not wind. A weight shift, deliberate. Diesel stood immediately, body between Mason and the stairs, a low growl building in his chest. The flashlight dimmed again, then snapped back. Mason switched it off and let the dark settle. He'd lived long enough in shadows to know how to breathe in them. The sound didn't return. They waited in silence, Diesel's body a warm line against his leg. Mason held the letter tight, the edges cutting slightly into his palm. When the moment passed, Mason clicked the light back on. The cabinets, the boxes, the photo, the names. It wasn't just old paperwork. It was a record, a map of betrayal that someone had tried to bury. And Diesel had found it. Mason turned toward the filing cabinets, opening one drawer after another. Names, survey plats, court receipts. A pattern emerged. Dozens of properties reassigned under dubious pretenses. Many stamped by a notary named N.K., Nathan Keene, mayor of Willow Ridge, grandson of the original land commissioner, and the man who ran the auction that sold Mason this house for 50 cents. A setup? A mistake? Or something worse? Mason wasn't sure yet. But Diesel had found what the town tried to erase, and that changed everything. The dog turned toward the stairs and let out a short bark, just once. Then silence. It was enough. Mason pocketed the letter, the photo, and 2 files. He gave Diesel a quick touch on the shoulder. Good work, soldier. They moved upstairs together. The house was still quiet. The wind hummed through the cracked window frame in the front room. But the air had changed. The silence wasn't just stillness anymore. It was cover. Mason locked the front door, closed the blinds, and sat at the kitchen table. Diesel curled nearby, still alert, ears turning at every shift in the floor. Mason opened the folder again, rereading the signature on the bottom of the last affidavit. It was his father's handwriting. Underneath, one final sentence. They'll come for the truth, but you're not alone. Mason looked at Diesel. No, he said softly. We're not. The road to Walter Grant's ranch cut through frozen fields, the kind that seemed to remember what had been buried beneath them. Mason gripped the wheel tighter as his truck rattled over a cattle guard. Diesel sat in the passenger seat, head up, eyes scanning the horizon. The house appeared like a silhouette against the gray sky, its paint faded to the color of old bones, its roof sagging under years of silence. Walter Grant was already waiting on the porch. The retired sheriff stood with a thermos in one hand and a flannel shirt buttoned to the neck. He didn't wave. Just watched. Mason parked near the barn and stepped out with the box of documents. Diesel followed close, tail low but steady. The dog's eyes never left the old man. You're Hale's boy, Grant said, voice rough like gravel left too long in the sun. Mason nodded. Mason, this is Diesel. The old man's gaze dropped to the shepherd. Diesel stared back, unblinking. Grant gave a short nod. Come inside. The house smelled like cedar and old books. Photos lined the hallway, uniformed officers shaking hands, posing at county fairs, standing beside ribbon cuttings. No one remembered anymore. The kitchen table was scratched and scarred, but clean. Grant poured black coffee and pushed a mug forward without asking. Mason placed the folder on the table and opened it to the photo of his father. He ever talked to you about the Keene family? He asked. Grant took one long look at the image, then set his mug down without drinking. I told him not to dig, he said softly. But your dad was stubborn. Same as you, I'm guessing. Mason didn't answer. Diesel circled the room once, then paused by an old sideboard cabinet. He sniffed the bottom drawer, tail frozen mid-swing. Grant saw it. "There's something in there," Mason said. The sheriff didn't move for a moment, then sighed. He pulled the drawer open slowly. Inside was a small metal tin. He opened it and took out an old leather collar. The brass tag clinked gently against the wood. The name stamped on the tag. Rex. Grant held it like it weighed more than it should. "Your dad's partner," he said. "Canine, Rex. Smartest dog I ever saw." Diesel stepped forward, nose trembling as he sniffed the collar. Then he froze. His body locked up, ears tilted back. A low whine escaped his throat. Then came a growl, not hostile but mournful. "Dogs remember," Grant murmured. "Scent doesn't lie, even after decades." Mason looked at him. "What happened?" Grant stared at the tag, then at Mason. "Your father and Rex were building a case. Land grabs, fraud. Nathan Keene's office was selling the same properties twice, sometimes to ghost buyers, sometimes just on paper. They had affidavits, maps, everything lined up. Your dad planned to go public. 2 days before he was set to testify, his car went off the ridge near Mill Creek. No skid marks, no brake lights, just a clean cut through the guardrail. Was it raining? Clear night, dry road. I got to the scene first. Your dad was alive, barely. But Rex was gone. We didn't find him for a week. He was laid out like a warning sign just past the quarry, throat slit, quiet, surgical. Mason's grip on the coffee mug tightened. "I had a wife and a boy starting high school." Grant continued. "I tried to take it up, but the mayor made it clear. The next accident wouldn't be clean. I boxed up what I had, buried it under paperwork, and told myself it wasn't my fight anymore." Diesel sat beside the collar, eyes locked on the leather as if expecting it to move. Grant leaned back. "I've lived with that choice every damn day. Seeing your dog react like that." His voice cracked. Rex was more than a dog. He knew, and they killed him to prove they could. Mason looked at Diesel, whose ears twitched as if he'd heard something only he understood. "What you found in that basement," Grant said slowly. "If it connects with what I buried all those years ago, this town's been built on stolen bones." Mason reached for the collar, held it gently. Diesel's nose brushed it once more, then he laid down, his head resting on Mason's boot like a vow. "You quit," Mason said, not accusing, just stating. "I did," Grant admitted, "and I won't run again. Not now." Mason stood, the collar in his hand, and Diesel beside him like a shadow brought to life. "We're not running either." The woman at the front desk didn't meet Mason's eyes. She wore a county badge on her sweater, the kind that looked hand-stitched and permanent. Her name tag read, Carla. And when she saw Mason approach, she straightened the papers in front of her, with slow, rehearsed motions. "I need to file a land fraud complaint," Mason said, placing the folder on the counter. Diesel sat beside him, tail still, gaze sweeping the office. "I've got signed deeds, maps, and copies of affidavits, some dating back 30 years. Carla glanced at the folder, then looked past him, toward the security camera above the door. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hale," she said. "You'll need to take that to the county attorney's office in Deerfield." Mason frowned. "I was told this is the place to start. That's policy now. Since when?" She didn't answer. Behind her, a clerk peeked through a glass door, then quickly disappeared. Mason didn't raise his voice. He'd learned long ago that pressure did more damage when delivered quietly. "Carla," he said, "my father almost died trying to bring this forward. Are you telling me nobody here will even read it?" Her lips pressed together. Her hand hovered over the folder, then pulled back. "I'm sorry," she repeated. "Truly." Diesel shifted his weight slightly. He could feel the tension before Mason did. They left without another word. Outside, the winter sun cast long shadows on the courthouse steps. As Mason opened the truck door, Diesel leapt in with practiced ease. Mason didn't speak until they were halfway down Main Street. "They've all been told," he muttered. "Every single one of them." They stopped at the post office to pick up a package Grant had mentioned, a box of duplicated documents he'd managed to scan before resigning. Mason expected to find a stack of files. What he didn't expect was the envelope waiting beside them. No return address, no name, just his. M. Hale. The handwriting was clean and slanted, too careful to be natural. He opened it in the truck. Inside, a printed letter on county letterhead, though the signature line was blank. "Dear Mr. Hale, following your recent acquisition, additional administrative and environmental restoration fees totaling $2,074.32 are now due. Failure to remit payment within 30 days will result in foreclosure review and property seizure." Attached was a copy of the supposed ordinance. Mason read it twice, then once more. Nowhere in the original bid or closing documents had any such fees been listed. The amount felt arbitrary, just large enough to sting, just vague enough to be hard to fight. He folded the paper slowly and looked at Diesel. "They're not even trying to hide it." The shepherd stared ahead, ears angled toward the diner at the corner. Mason didn't realize how much he needed a break until he stepped inside. The smell of bacon grease and old coffee hit like comfort. Diesel padded behind him, leash loose. The bell above the door chimed once. Heads turned, conversations paused. He walked to the counter. The waitress behind it, a woman in her 50s with grey hair and tired eyes, froze halfway through pouring coffee. Mason offered a polite nod. "Can we get a booth?" She didn't answer. She looked past him, toward the kitchen. A man stepped out. Tall, apron-stained, his arms crossed in front of him. "We're closed." Mason looked around. 4 customers sat at various booths, chewing slowly. "Sign says open." The man's eyes fell to Diesel. "No dogs allowed," he said flatly. "He's a service dog." Mason replied, "Don't care. He's trained, and I served. I said we're closed." The man grabbed a broom leaning by the wall, not swinging it, just holding it, tapping the handle softly on the tile. Diesel didn't flinch, but his body stilled, ears drawn back. A low vibration hummed from his throat. Not a growl, a warning. Mason raised a hand gently. Diesel went still. "You should leave," the man said. Not angry, just tired, or scared. Mason held his gaze for a breath longer than comfort allowed, then turned. Diesel followed. Outside, the cold was sharper. The wind carried a bite that hadn't been there earlier. Across the street, a mother gripped her child's hand and pulled them away when she saw Diesel. Mason exhaled through his nose. They've made their choice. Back at the stone house, the mailbox held another envelope. He opened it before stepping inside. Another notice? This time from the utility company. Reviewing his account for unusual usage and threatening a scheduled inspection. Mason crumpled it and dropped it on the table. Diesel paced the hallway, his steps quicker, more alert. His nose brushed the corners, the vents, the baseboards. He was on edge. Mason sat at the kitchen table, hands flat against the wood. "They're tightening the noose." Diesel returned and sat beside him, watching the door. His body was tense, eyes unblinking. That night, as the wind howled over the hills, Mason checked every lock twice. Diesel didn't sleep. He lay at the front door, head resting on his paws, ears twitching at every distant creak. Outside, Willeridge remained quiet. Too quiet. Emily Ross didn't hesitate. The moment Mason called and mentioned his father's name, she asked for an address. She didn't need convincing. Years ago, she had covered a deployment farewell ceremony where Mason stood at attention while his mother cried silently behind the chain-link fence. She remembered the article. She remembered the look in his eyes. Now she was here, notebook in one pocket, voice recorder in the other, her boots crunching across Mason's gravel driveway as Diesel watched from the porch like a sentry. "Your dog going to bite me?" she asked. "If he does," Mason replied, "you'll deserve it." Emily smiled. Diesel didn't. Inside, the table was already covered in folders. Mason poured coffee. Diesel lay near the hallway, eyes fixed on the door, unmoving. Emily scanned the documents. One page, then another. The names, the signatures, the forged deeds, and finally the photograph of Mason's father with Rex. Her fingers hovered over the image. "This is the same Keene family that holds office now?" Mason nodded. "Same blood, same game." Emily leaned back. "If even half of this is legit, we're talking fraud, conspiracy, abuse of office." "And attempted murder," Mason added. She looked up. "The crash that nearly killed my dad wasn't an accident." Diesel stood suddenly, his ears angled toward the window. A low growl rose in his chest. Emily moved to the window, pulling the curtain slightly. "Black SUV, parked across the road." Mason stood slowly. Diesel stepped between him and the door. Emily reached into her bag, pulled out her phone, and snapped a picture. "They see you? They want to." Diesel didn't stop growling until the SUV pulled away 10 minutes later. Emily sat back down, breath steadier. "I'll go independent," she said. "If I publish this with my paper, it gets buried or I get fired. But I've got contacts. Denver, maybe farther." Mason didn't answer. He walked to the kitchen, opened the fridge, and froze. The pilot light on the stove flickered erratically. The smell hit him mid-step, faint but sharp. Gas. He turned instantly. "Emily, get out!" She blinked. "What?" "Now." He reached under the sink, shut the valve off manually. Diesel barked twice, spinning in a tight circle, nose pressed near the stove base, his body coiled like a spring. Mason flung the back door open. Cold air rushed in. Emily grabbed her bag and bolted outside, Diesel right behind her. Out in the yard, Mason checked the tank. The connector had been tampered with. Tape residue where the regulator had been twisted loose, then sealed again to hide the breach. Not just sabotage. Silent intent. Emily stared at the stove from the back steps. "They tried to kill you." Mason didn't answer. Diesel sat beside him, eyes locked on the tree line. "Not just me," Mason said. "You were in there, too." "Jesus," she whispered. Diesel whined once, then went still again, his body motionless but alert. Every part of him pulled toward whatever he sensed beyond the shadows. Mason followed his gaze. Out past the fence line, the cottonwoods stood like thin soldiers. At their base, something shifted. Not a sound, not a figure, just motion. Barely there. Emily stepped closer, voice low. "You think they're watching now?" "I think they never stopped." That night, Diesel refused to sleep. He paced the house from room to room, always circling back to Mason. Every time the wind pressed against the shutters, he lifted his head. Mason didn't sleep either. He sat at the table with the files in front of him, his father's letter folded beside the collar from Rex. The stove had worked fine that morning. The leak hadn't been there. It was meant to kill. No fire, no noise, just sleep that never ended. Diesel had stopped it. Mason reached down, hand resting on the dog's head. Diesel leaned into the touch, silent but firm. "You're not just a dog," Mason whispered. "You're the reason I'm still breathing." Diesel didn't move, just stayed. Outside, the black SUV didn't return, but something deeper had entered Willow Ridge now. The truth was no longer buried, and someone wanted it dead. The first sign was silence. Walter Grant didn't show up at the meeting point near the old water tower outside town. He was never late. He never missed a check-in. Mason's gut clenched the moment the clock passed the hour. Emily paced beside the truck, her phone to her ear, voicemail again. Still nothing. Diesel sat in the truck bed, eyes locked on the horizon, body still as a statue. Then headlights appeared. Wrong shape, wrong timing. A black SUV slowed near the edge of the dirt road and rolled to a stop. The passenger window lowered. No words, just an arm that tossed something into the dirt before the vehicle spun its tires and disappeared back into the dark. Mason rushed forward. A hat, Walter's. The brim was dark with blood. Diesel growled. Not loud, not showy. A deep, vibrating rumble that came from somewhere ancient. Inside the SUV's tracks, they found a slip of paper sealed in plastic. "You want him alive? Bring the documents. 11 p.m. Old Barn off Route 12. Come alone." Emily stared at the note. "You're not going alone." Mason didn't answer. His eyes were already on Diesel, who stared into the distance with ears twitching towards the east. "We're not giving them the real files," Emily said. "They won't know the difference." Mason replied. "You sure?" "No, but if we don't show, Walter's dead." The barn was older than memory. Set back off the road, the roof half caved in. Inside, the scent of rust, oil, and something darker filled the air. The structure groaned like it resented being part of this. Mason entered first, holding a duffel bag filled with decoy files. Diesel padded beside him, head low, every muscle taut. Keene was there, not in a suit, not behind a desk, just standing near a work light with a folder in hand and two men flanking him. Walter sat tied to a chair, blood down the side of his face, breathing ragged. "Nice of you to come," Keene said. "I was starting to think you'd gotten smart." Mason dropped the bag. "Let him go." Keene lifted the duffel with his foot. "Originals?" "Everything you asked for." Keene unzipped it, flipped through the top folder, smirked. "You always were your father's son." Mason moved toward Walter. One of the men stepped in his way. "You've got what you want," Mason said. "He goes free." Keene looked bored. "He's a relic. I don't need to hurt him. I just need to remind you how fragile people are." From behind, Diesel growled sharply. And then, motion. Diesel turned, not toward Keene or his men, but toward the back of the barn, nose to the ground, then snapping up. He darted toward a stack of broken pallets and began pawing at the floorboards. Mason recognized the movement immediately. The dog wasn't reacting. He was tracking. "Diesel, what is it?" Mason asked. The shepherd barked once, then began scraping furiously at the planks. One of Keene's men moved to stop him. "Don't," Mason said, voice sharp. But it was too late. Diesel lunged at the floor, tore up a loose board, and revealed a sloped concrete chute, an old coal drop from when the barn had been part of a furnace operation. Escape. Keene stepped forward. "You think you're getting out of here?" Mason didn't answer. He rushed to Walter, cutting the ropes with his knife. The older man slumped, barely conscious. Keene raised his voice. "You walk out with him, and I burn this town down with you in it." Mason lifted Walter over his shoulder. "You already did." Diesel was already at the opening, barking, urging them forward. Mason ducked into the chute, dragging Walter behind him, Emily covering from behind as she reversed the truck and aimed the headlights toward the barn door. Keene shouted something, too late. His men scrambled, but Diesel charged up the incline, knocking one off balance with a growl that echoed off metal. Mason and Emily hauled Walter into the back of the truck. Diesel leapt in beside them as the tires spit gravel and launched them back towards the main road. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Walter coughed. His voice was weak. "You gave them the files." "Copies," Mason said. Walter's hand trembled as it reached out and gripped Diesel's fur. "No one's ever come for me before," he whispered. "No one. Except this dog." Diesel didn't move. He just pressed closer. The truck kept going. And behind them, the barn lights vanished. They'd lost the original documents. But they'd saved a life, and Diesel had found the way out when no one else could. Emily spread the maps across the kitchen table, her hands smudged with ink, voice low but urgent. The old floor creaked beneath her boots as she moved from one copy to the next. The table had become a war room, filled with printouts, annotations, statements gathered in whispered conversations. "These plots line up exactly," she said, tracing her pen along the survey lines. "Over a dozen families pushed off the land. Same signature on the county approvals every time." Mason leaned over the documents. Keen's initials. Or his father's. Some go back further, but the notary seal is always the same. And look here, these properties were sold days before a road expansion project got green-lit. She lifted a folder. Public record shows they bought the land back at quadruple the original price. From one of Keen's shell companies. Mason exhaled slowly. Stolen, then flipped. Emily nodded. "This wasn't sloppy corruption. It was calculated." Diesel sat beside the wood stove, ears flicking toward every movement. He hadn't slept more than a few hours at a time since the night in the barn. But he stayed close, watchful. Walter Grant, still bruised but more upright, took slow sips of coffee as he listened from the side chair. "I buried pieces of this 20 years ago. I didn't think it would ever see daylight." "You're not the only one," Mason said. "I think it's time we knock on a few doors." They started with the Hollands, an elderly couple whose property had been condemned in 2006 for a public interest project that never materialized. Their trailer now sat on the edge of town, flanked by rusted-out trucks and a bent mailbox. Diesel waited at the fence as Mason approached. He didn't bark, just sat, calm but visible. The door opened a crack. Mrs. Holland peeked out. Mason introduced himself. She almost closed the door until Diesel stepped forward and gently rested his head against the gate. The door stayed open. Inside, she pulled out a shoebox filled with papers. Receipts, photos. A letter stamped in red ink. Final notice. "This was our family's land," she said softly. "My husband died trying to fight them." Diesel laid at her feet as she spoke, unmoving, a quiet presence that filled more space than words could. Later that week, Mason stopped at a farmhouse near the ridge. A boy sat on the porch, arms wrapped around his knees, staring out at the fields. His mother stood nearby, wary. Diesel trotted ahead. The boy didn't flinch as the shepherd approached. Instead, he reached out and placed a hand on Diesel's head. "He likes me," the boy said. The mother's posture shifted. "My husband served," she said. "He tried to stop Keen, too. We lost everything." She brought out a folder of documents stored in the bottom of an old sewing machine cabinet. "If this helps, take it." Every visit was the same. At first, silence. Then a glance at the dog. Then the truth. Diesel, it turned out, was the only witness people still trusted. The files grew into boxes, maps filled with pushpins, statements signed in pen. Emily documented each one, her laptop buzzing late into the night. She reached out to a contact at a federal agency, quietly, off the record. By the end of the week, there were over 20 families, each story small, each one with the same name buried somewhere in the paperwork. Keen. But it wasn't just names and numbers. It was grief. It was memory. It was anger. And it was healing. One night, Mason stepped out onto the porch. Diesel followed, his nails tapping softly on the wood. Across the street, porch lights flicked on one by one. Neighbors who had avoided eye contact days ago now offered cautious waves. The town had started to turn, not because of fear, but because of a dog that waited, watched, and listened. "You're doing more than I ever could," Mason whispered. Diesel looked up, tail giving a single quiet thump. Inside, Emily printed the last affidavit. Walter leaned over her shoulder. "We're not just building a case," he said. "We're restoring a damn memory." She nodded. "And this town's finally remembering who it is." The next morning, a box was left on Mason's porch. No note, no name. Inside were blueprints from the original town hall, highlighted sections marked "Restricted" in faded pen. Diesel sniffed the box once and sat down beside it. Mason didn't have to ask. The people had chosen. And Diesel was now more than just a guard dog. He was the town's conscience, its compass, its witness. And he wasn't leaving. It happened faster than anyone expected. 3 days after Emily submitted the compiled files to her contact at the office of the Inspector General, unmarked vehicles rolled into Willowridge before dawn. Black jackets, no sirens, just quiet urgency and clipboards. By mid-morning, the county clerk's office was sealed. The records vault at City Hall was locked down. Agents moved like they'd practiced this raid 100 times, because maybe they had, just never here. The town watched from behind curtains and pick-up windows. Mason stood on the porch of the stone house, coffee cooling in his hand. Diesel sat beside him, perfectly still, as if he already knew the outcome, as if he'd always known. Emily arrived just after noon, her car dust-covered and her eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. "They got it," she said, breathless. "Everything. Not just land fraud, veterans' benefits, disability allotments, funding for K-9 service units. Keene rerouted it all through dummy non-profits. Millions." Mason said nothing. He looked out toward the hills. "There's more," Emily added. "They traced it back almost 2 decades. Some of it started before Keene, but he built the machine." "What now?" he asked. "He resigned this morning. Disappeared before they could serve the first subpoena." Mason let out a slow exhale. "Coward." Emily shrugged. "Criminal." Diesel's ears perked toward the gravel road. A rusted pickup bounced into the drive. An older man stepped out, hat in hand, holding a folder tight to his chest. "I think this belongs in better hands," he said. Mason walked down to meet him. The man passed over the folder with a hesitant smile. "My father kept every receipt, every map. He always said someone would come along who gave a damn." Diesel stepped forward, sniffed the man's boot, then leaned gently against his leg. The man froze. Then, slowly, he lowered his hand and rested it on Diesel's head. By the next morning, 6 more people came. A widow with a letter from her husband, once a councilman. A young woman with her grandfather's tax records. A teenager carrying a worn photo and a locked box he couldn't open. All walked past the iron gate and up the porch steps, greeted by the dog who had become the symbol of quiet rebellion. They came not with noise or signs or slogans, but with memory. Diesel stayed at his post, tail occasionally thumping, body pressed close to each visitor just long enough to say, "You're safe now." That afternoon, a certified letter arrived from the federal case coordinator. It confirmed what Mason already suspected. The land records were fraudulent. The auction was illegal. The house, by both blood and right, belonged to him. It had always belonged to his father. The paper trail was simply the last formality. Mason sat on the steps, the letter in his hand. Diesel curled beside him, his head resting on Mason's knee. "I wish he'd lived to see this," Mason whispered. Diesel shifted slightly, just enough to press his weight more fully against him, as if to say, he did. Emily stayed late that evening, typing on her laptop from the porch swing. Walter, still limping but sharper by the day, cleaned the old barn down the hill. No one asked him to. He simply started. When the sun dropped behind the cottonwoods, porch lights began flickering across town. For the first time in weeks, they didn't feel like searchlights. They felt like lanterns being lit for homecoming. Mason stood, stretched, and looked down at the dog who had never once backed away. Not from darkness, not from bullets, not from truth. "Still guarding, huh?" he said quietly. Diesel didn't move, just blinked once, then closed his eyes, letting the cool evening air settle over him. The war had not been fought with guns. It had been fought with files, with memory, and with a dog who refused to look away. And now, finally, the town was beginning to look back. Mason kept the door open. The first floor of the stone mansion no longer felt like a place to hide. It had become something different, a sanctuary made of evidence, memory, and healing. Mason cleared out the old dining room, ripped up the warped linoleum, and polished the original oak floors. Then he lined the walls with boards, hung maps, pinned red threads, and labeled boxes. He didn't call it a museum. It didn't need a name. The town already knew what it was. People came with more than documents now. They brought stories, photographs, a receipt for a loan never approved, a ribbon from a dog show where Rex had once taken first place. Every item added another thread to the fabric of truth. Mason placed them carefully in plastic sleeves or glass boxes. Diesel watched from the corner, his head always lifting when a new voice entered the room. He never barked. He didn't need to. Emily turned the porch into her newsroom. She ran an extension cord out the front window, parked her laptop on a bench, and worked for days. The headline she finally settled on wasn't about Mason or Grant or even the Keens. It was about Diesel. The dog that dug the truth. It ran as a 5-part feature in a national investigative series. Veterans across the country wrote in. Canine handlers, widows, whistleblowers, people who had lost trust in silence and found it again in a dog who refused to let go. When Emily read the final piece aloud on the porch, Mason listened quietly. So did Diesel, curled at the base of the swing. "Think he knows?" Emily asked when she finished. Mason looked down. Diesel's eyes were closed, but his ear twitched at the sound of her voice. "He's known all along," Mason said. Walter Grant came by more often. He still moved slowly, a cane in one hand, but his voice had grown stronger. He began meeting with kids who came to visit the archives, mostly boys who still thought about becoming police officers someday. He'd sit at the edge of the front room, beside a case with Rex's old collar, and tell them stories. About mistakes, about courage, about what it meant to tell the truth when it hurt more than silence. And always, Diesel was there. Sometimes he'd nudge a kid's hand. Sometimes he'd just sit close enough for them to feel his breath and know they weren't alone. One afternoon, a boy named Tyler leaned down and whispered something to Diesel. Mason didn't hear the words, but he saw the dog lift his head, press his nose gently to the boy's forehead, and close his eyes. Tyler didn't stop smiling for an hour. People started calling the house the guard house, not for its walls, but for who sat on the porch. Veterans came, teachers, journalists, even a former state auditor who once backed out of an investigation into Keen's records arrived in an old Jeep and left behind a box marked 2003 unfiled. Mason didn't ask questions. He just nodded, took the box, and found a place for it. Late one night, after everyone had gone, Mason stood at the front door, watching the wind bend the cottonwoods. Diesel sat beside him, not guarding anymore, but present. Always present. "You didn't just help find the truth," Mason whispered. "You became it." Diesel didn't move, but Mason could feel it in his chest, the unspoken answer only a dog like him could give. The past was no longer buried. It was breathing. It had weight. It had place. And it had a guardian. The first warm wind of spring drifted down from the hills, carrying the scent of new grass and thawed earth. The stone mansion sat quiet under the soft light, no longer a place haunted by silence, but one held up by it. Mason sat on the front steps, elbows resting on his knees, a mug of coffee gone cold in his hand. His boots were muddy from the morning's planting. The garden, once overrun with weeds, had started to grow again. Not just flowers, vegetables, herbs, promise. Beside him, Diesel lay stretched out on the porch boards, chin resting between his paws. His fur was grayer now, especially around the muzzle, and he moved a little slower these days. But his eyes, they were just as sharp, just as steady. From the road, a group of kids passed by, laughing, kicking up dust. One of them stopped. A boy, 8, maybe 9, climbed halfway up the front path and pointed at the dog. "Is he still guarding the house?" he asked. Mason looked down at Diesel. The shepherd didn't move, just blinked, slow and calm. Mason smiled. "He's not guarding the house," he said. "He's guarding the truth." The boy blinked like he wasn't sure if it was a riddle or an answer, then nodded solemnly, turned, and ran to catch up with the others. Inside, the radio crackled to life. Mason had forgotten he'd left it on. "Tonight," said the voice of a reporter from the regional public station, "we honor a dog who didn't bark for food, but for the silence we were too afraid to break." Diesel lifted his head. Not all the way, just enough to listen. Mason leaned back against the railing, watching the cottonwoods shift in the breeze. He thought about everything that had passed through those doors, the secrets pulled from the basement, the threats, the faces of people who once turned away and now stopped by with stories. And Diesel. Always Diesel. He hadn't just uncovered the past. He had carried it. Carried the memories of a dog named Rex. Carried the last breath of Mason's father. Carried a town back to its conscience. Some nights, Mason still woke to the sound of wind and wondered if the SUV would return, if the darkness would press in again. But every time he looked to his side and saw Diesel there, still watching, still guarding, that weight lifted just enough. As the sun dipped below the ridge, Mason whispered, "We're not done, are we?" Diesel didn't answer. He didn't have to. The radio hummed behind them, fading into a soft instrumental. The porch light flicked on automatically. Across the street, an elderly woman opened her screen door and placed a folder on the curb, then nodded toward the house. Mason stood, walked over, picked it up. Inside, land records from 1972, stamped with a seal that should never have been used. Another thread, another voice, another truth. He returned to the steps, set the folder beside him, and rubbed behind Diesel's ears. "Still guarding," Mason said quietly. "Still listening." Diesel's tail thumped once against the wood. The screen faded to black. Then white letters appeared. He didn't bark for food. He barked for the truth. What's your story with a loyal pet? If Diesel's journey moved you, help us honor the silent guardians who serve without question. Subscribe to the German Shepherd channel, share your own stories in the comments, and tell us, where in the world are you watching from? We always read them, and Diesel's still listening.